Laura Burns, Head of Terrorism Research at George Washington University's Program on Extremism. And with me here today is Senior Research Fellow Jennifer Baker. Hi, Jennifer.
Hi, Laura.
We are here to continue telling the history of Hamas, both in the Middle East and in the United States.
Laura, so in our last episode, we focused on the engineer, Yahya Ayyash, Hamas's bomb maker, and some of the attacks he was responsible for. Did Hamas conduct other attacks that were not suicide bombings or other types of bombs?
Well, yes, they did. They still continue to employ all types of attacks, especially attacks with firearms. One example occurred, unfortunately, in May of 1996 and involved the murder of a U.S. citizen, a teenager, who was waiting on his bus at a bus stop.
David Boehm, the son of Stanley and Joyce Boehm, was a yeshiva student in Beit El outside Jerusalem in 1996. He had the terrible misfortune of standing at a bus stop waiting for a bus to take him home at the same time that a man named Salah al-Aruri was a relatively young Hamas commander in Gaza. And Aruri decided that that day would be an appropriate time to send out a couple of his operatives to commit a terror attack. They first thought about attacking an army base, but thought better of that and decided that an easier task would be attacking a young Israeli yeshiva student at a bus stop. So these two guys came up to the bus stop and shot David Boehm in the head. He lingered for a little while. His poor mother had to ride in an ambulance with him to the hospital, but he had no chance, and he died that day. This was back in 1996 when he was 17 years old.
Now, you said there were two Hamas operatives that were involved in the murder. Is that right?
That's correct.
What ultimately happened to those operatives?
One of them died in a suicide bombing subsequent to his killing David Boehm. And the other was eventually prosecuted in a Palestinian court, put in jail for, I think, 10 years for David's murder, but then was eventually killed in another terror incident. So both of those people were wiped out, were eliminated, essentially eliminated themselves.
So on that note, let me just ask you this. So just to be clear, both of the operatives involved in David's murder went on to commit additional terrorist attacks.
That is true. And more significant, the man who was very involved in ordering these attacks 28 years ago, a guy named Salah al-Aruri, progressed, became a higher and higher level commander within Hamas, and eventually was involved in helping to plan the attacks of October 7th, 2023. Mr. al-Aruri was earlier this year eliminated by the Israeli Defense Forces, where he was hiding in Lebanon. That I think was a very significant action by the IDF. And it tends to show the persistence of Hamas, that this same gentleman who was involved in planning the attack that ended up in killing David Boehm 28 years ago continued to be involved in Hamas terrorism up to and including the October 7th attacks, and was only stopped when he was eliminated by the military action of the IDF earlier this year.
That's terrible. A teenager shot in the head by Hamas while he was waiting on a bus to go home. It seems like something as simple as taking public transportation in Israel in the mid-1990s would have been extremely dangerous.
Yes, Hamas knew how to kill, but it also knew how to instill fear in the civilian population. And we're going to talk more about the murder of David Boehm when we get in a later episode, because there are going to be some developments in that matter that are going to be relevant to what we're talking about. a case relating to his murder will reveal additional facts about this U.S.-based Hamas infrastructure. We'll talk about that later.
Okay. So speaking of that U.S.-based infrastructure during the mid to late 1996, early 1997, what were the HLF, the IAP, the UASR, and CARE doing?
Well, I mean, it was business as usual. The HLF continued to fund the Hamas social infrastructure in Gaza and the West Bank, including most of the entities that they supported before the 1993 conspiratorial meeting, before Hamas was designated as a especially designated terrorist in January of 95. They continued to support the same groups.
Okay. Did they evolve their methods considering there was some heat on them, especially in the media?
Yes, they had opened an HLF office in Jerusalem to kind of assist with the coordination of their funding efforts to the Hamas social infrastructure in the West Bank, kind of add a layer of protection between them and who the ultimate recipients were. It was run at the time by a man named Mohammed Anati. They also employed their motto from the Philadelphia meeting. Remember that war is deception?
Right.
When Shukri Abu Bakr said, I swear by your God that war is deception, deceive, camouflage, pretend, deceive your enemy.
I remember that topic very well. And as I recall, the people they wanted to lie to the most were the Americans.
Yes, they did. And when Marzook was arrested, and during his time in jail, those newspaper articles and editorials, they really brought a lot of attention and heat on these organizations that were part of the infrastructure. And they began to develop their deceitful response to the allegations. So on April 1st of 1996, a reporter from the Dallas Morning News contacted Shukri Abu Bakr about whether or not the HLF had ever supported Hamas. We can look at some excerpts from this call between the reporter and Shukri Abu Bakr. Therein, the reporter, Gail Reeves, asked Shukri Abu Bakr if the HLF ever took a more political stance, and now, had they stepped back from that now that Hamas was designated? And Shukri Abu Bakr replied that the HLF had never raised money for Hamas, and said, I dare anybody to say, Shukri, you wrote or you stood up in front of a conference to ask money for Hamas. We have never done this. We have never written in any communication used the word Hamas.
Well, I think we saw a lot about Hamas in those festival tapes we played in earlier episodes, where the HLF raised money and Hamas was praised.
Yes, you're correct. We did. We saw that repeatedly. And despite Shukri Abu Bakr saying he dares anyone to say he ever wrote any communication using the word Hamas, a look back at an older IAP publication where donations were solicited for the Occupied Land Fund. Remember, that was the original name of the Holy Land Foundation, still run by Shukri Abu Bakr. And that IAP publication contained a poem about the Palestinian cause. And it ended with a statement, the Hamas Hazeum has arrived, and we will not accept other than Hamas. And that poem, where he says we will not accept other than Hamas, that was written by Shukri Abu Bakr.
Well, that is certainly interesting. And Shukri's statements seem to be contradicted by a lot of the material we've seen in this series. Was there an article that was published about this?
About the call with the reporter? Yes. On April 8th, 1996, the Dallas Morning News published an article entitled Paper Trail Leads to Hamas. Two organizations based in Richardson deny they promote agenda of anti-Israeli terrorists.
Yes, I read this article, and it's pretty detailed and quite long, but it includes information on the IAP, the HLF, Marzook al-Barasi, Ghassan al-Ashi, and it said that the Israel government had closed the HLF Jerusalem's office.
Yes, that's right. Remember we talked about in the last episode, I think, where they were worried about their offices being closed as a result of those suicide bombings. And in fact, the Israeli government did for a time shut down the HLF's Jerusalem office, as well as other charitable institutions that were believed to be associated with Hamas. A lot of times those closures were temporary, depending on changes that were made in the leadership and things like that. That article reported, quote, officials of the Islamic Association for Palestine and the Holy Land Foundation say they want peace between Israel and the Palestinian people and that they deplore the killing of innocent people.
Well, that is the opposite of what they discussed in the 1993 Philadelphia meeting, where they plotted to defeat the peace at all costs.
Yes. And where, as we've seen the festivals that they attended and raised funds at, where there was an absolute advocacy for violence against the Jewish people. And in fact, they would depict the killing of Jews on stage. Oh, and it's also the opposite of what we saw in an earlier episode when they called the brutal suicide bombing that we saw footage of a beautiful operation. Quite the opposite.
And this article led to congressional testimony by a counterterrorism expert in June of 1996.
Yes. And in a search warrant for the HLF, or of the HLF that we'll talk about at a later time, a document was identified where it showed them constructing their responses to these various allegations that were made before Congress by this counterterrorism expert. Their document began by stating that the recent testimony was an attack on Islam in general, and went on to talk about free speech and intolerance. And I just want to take a minute here to recognize the fact that they're using words that would resonate with the American people. The tenets of this country is founded on its freedom of religion and freedom of speech and things like that. And so if you think back to the Philadelphia meeting, they talked about the need to use terms that the Americans would understand. I think this is a pretty good example of that, because the testimony before Congress, from what I've read, related specifically to terrorist organizations and had nothing to do with religion and free speech. And in this document that they were constructing to responses to the allegations, they went on to say that Marzook had no role in founding the HLF. But you will recall the original document that we saw in several episodes showing the structure of the U.S.-based Hamas organizations. The infrastructure was known as the Palestine Committee, and it showed Marzook at the head of it. And the HLF, of course, it was OLF at the time, under it. And Shukr Abu Bakr was number 11 on the list of leaders within that infrastructure. But something else I'm not sure we've talked about. There was an International Muslim Brotherhood memorandum seized from El Bourassa's home that discussed how the HLF, the IAP, and the UASR were formed to support Hamas. And I want us to take a look at that document. This document dates to 1992, so it's old, but it bears looking at in detail. It's an old document predating the time period we're discussing right now, but it is directly relevant to the founding of the HLF, and in fact, pertinent to the topic that we're discussing, where the HLF denies, in these articles, that it's related to Hamas or Marzook. This document was in Arabic and entitled The Islamic Action for Palestine, an internal memo, October of 1992. And again, was located among the other Hamas and Muslim Brotherhood documents in the home of Ismail el-Bourassa, who we see was one of the leaders within that document. The Muslim Brotherhood memo begins with an explanation of why the Palestinian cause is so important to it. And that included the fact that within Israel, there's a location of Islamic holy sites, but also because the struggle is with the Jews. This is a quote, who do not constitute a danger to Palestine alone, but a danger to Arabs and Muslims in their homelands, their resources, religion, traditions, influence, and political entity.
And the Muslim Brotherhood considered Jewish people enemies like Hamas did.
Yes, and this memorandum went on to explain how the Muslim Brotherhood began to support the Palestinian cause in the 1980s, before the Intifada. And then it talked about how when the first Intifada erupted, and looking at this document, remember, Ikhwan is the Arabic term for Muslim Brotherhood. It discussed how it was incumbent upon the Muslim Brotherhood branches to form Palestine committees, whose job it is to make the Palestinian cause victorious and to support it with what it needs of media, money, men, and all of that. And then the next section in this document discussed the creation of Hamas as being, quote, bred in the bosom of the mother movement, the Muslim Brotherhood. It leaves no room for question on that. But importantly, in section 5 of this document, the memo lays out how Hamas was supported in North America.
Oh, I see. In this section where they talk about the U.S.-based Palestine Committee being tasked with supervising all the organizations which serve the plan of the movement. And I think we said earlier that the movement is the reference to Hamas, whose full name is the Islamic Resistance Movement.
Yes, that's right. That's right. And, take a look at the organizations who were, according to this Muslim Brotherhood memorandum, who were to serve the movement, Hamas. It was the IAP, the Occupied Land Fund, which was the original name of the Holy Land Foundation, and the UASR. And in the end of the memo, when explaining why they were submitting this memo now in 1992, which of course was several years after the creation of Hamas and its US-based infrastructure, the memo explained, quote, Islam's cause in Palestine needs today an effective and distinguished role for the grand Islamic movement as one fortified wall behind its leadership and a strong support for their tool and striking wing, the Islamic Resistance Movement, Hamas.
So this, Laura, along with the plethora of other materials we examined during the series, clearly demonstrates that HLF's connections to Hamas since the inception.
Yes, you are correct. So while the HLF and IAP are attempting to deny any affiliation with Hamas and implementing their plan that they set about in 1993 to deceive the American public, well, while they were doing that, Hamas continued to operate.
Okay, so while this was happening, Marzook was in prison in the U.S. And I think you said earlier he was not ultimately extradited. Is that right? Not to Israel. But what happened to him then?
So in May of 1997, he was, instead of being extradited to Israel, he was deported to Jordan, where he joined the Hamas political bureau chief at the time, Khalid Mishal, and other Hamas political bureau leaders, and continued his endeavors on behalf of the terrorist organization. In archived Associated Press coverage, we can see him here with Khalid Mishal after he was deported to Jordan.
Okay. So the U.S. did not extradite Marzook to Israel. So I bet Hamas is pretty happy about that.
Yes. In the footage we were just examining, Marzook actually said that they wanted peace more than anyone.
The Palestinian people, they're looking for their right and for their future, and they're desperate for peace more than any other nation in the world.
So if that was the case, did Hamas stop bombing and committing murders to disrupt the peace process?
No. Instead, they conducted a triple suicide bombing in a crowded pedestrian mall in Jerusalem. The name of that mall area is Ben Yehuda Street, and it was a very popular hangout spot. So on September 4th, 1997, BBC News reported 8 people were killed and 150 were injured in a series of 3 suicide bomb attacks in the center of Jerusalem, in the heart of a packed pedestrian area, where they reported the attackers detonated their, quote, nail bombs, and Hamas claimed responsibility. And there were a number of U.S. citizens in Jerusalem at the time of this bombing. And one of those was a young man at the time named Ron Shiloh.
My name is Ron Shiloh. I am an Israeli-American doctor. I live outside of Boston, Massachusetts. I was born in Israel, but moved with my parents to the US when I was about a year old, and then grew up in the United States. Over the summer, as a child, many summers to visit with family, and spent a lot of my time in Israel over the summers, as I said, and really developed a deep connection to the country and its people. In 1997, it was the summer between my junior and senior year of college, and I wanted to visit Israel. And that summer, it happened to be that a number of different friends of mine also were coming independently to Israel to visit. And so one of my friends came for a visit, and he suggested that we go to Jerusalem for a few days. I had another college friend who was also visiting, and so she and I agreed to meet at a cafe on Ben Yehuda Street in kind of central Jerusalem at around noon on that specific Thursday. It was interesting because I actually also had a cousin who was getting married that evening in a nature reserve about an hour outside of Jerusalem. It was September 4th. Ben Yehuda Street it's actually a pedestrian mall. So it's kind of this interesting, pretty busy thoroughfare in the heart of modern Jerusalem. So there's little gift shops and ice cream shops, coffee shops, all of that. So I met my friend, and we were sitting at an outdoor table, and we were just enjoying ourselves. I thought I was going to be meeting my friend for an hour, and then we'd be on our way. But 1 hour rolled into the next, and so at 3, I finally said to my friend, I said, I really have to get going because I need to go and change and get picked up. And so we settled our bill, and we got up, and we started to walk down the street. My friend Irit actually went into this convenience store, and I was just kind of standing outside waiting for her, when all of a sudden there was just this loud boom that kind of just rattled everything. It shook me completely. And it took me just a second to realize what it was. It was an explosion. I didn't quite know what to do. And then there was a second explosion that happened that sounded closer than the first one did. So I started to run away from the sounds of the explosions. And as I was running, someone just kind of pulled me into a shop. It was just this kind of small little shop, and we all were huddled in there. And then I heard a third explosion closer again. And so it was very frightening. We were not sure what was happening exactly, like if there was going to be yet another explosion and if it was going to be closer yet to where we were. And then it just kind of got quiet, and there were sirens. I finally decided to leave the shoe store. And it just so happened as I left the shoe store that my friend was right across the street. And so she waved to me, and so I ran across to her, and we embraced, and then we kind of started to try to figure out what we needed to do next. Most people were kind of running away from where this was happening. And then there were also people who were running towards it, the Zaka brigades, who come to kind of collect remains of bodies, so that they can be appropriately buried. When we went back to see what had happened, that's when we realized that the cafe that we had just been sitting at 10 minutes earlier was the target of one of the suicide attacks. I didn't know that they were suicide attackers in the moment. I later found out that they were suicide attackers, but I knew there were 3 explosions. In the days afterwards, learning the identities of some of the people who were killed, and there was a lot of focus on the fact that there were on the terrible fact that there were 14-year-old girls who were killed in the attack. One of the victims of the attack was a 48-year-old man. I mean, it cuts people's lives short, no matter how old you are. I called my aunt, whose daughter was getting married, and she hadn't even heard about this yet, but was obviously grateful that I was okay. She managed to calm me down a little bit, which in hindsight, I think it's just part of the Israeli mentality, is these things happen and you just kind of move on and try to move on to the next thing. And then my aunt's friends came to pick me up, and we got to the wedding, and it was literally 3 hours later. I mean, the explosion, these suicide attacks had happened just 3 hours before the wedding. And now I was all of a sudden in this wedding in this beautiful nature reserve outside Jerusalem. It just felt like this was just, unfortunately, something that people were somewhat used to. And then I do remember, most of the music afterwards was Israeli music, and there was a lot of dancing. But towards the end of the evening, they played "I Will Survive," and it got me. It just suddenly hit me in that moment. I had narrowly survived this suicide attack.
Wow. I just can't imagine having lunch with a friend at a cafe, and then 10 minutes later, a suicide bomber blows up the cafe. That's crazy.
It's such a scary thought, but it was, becoming commonplace for the people in Israel. Another U.S. citizen was there in Jerusalem that day, Franklin Jerome, a U.S. citizen born in New Jersey and raised in the Midwest, who is now living in Israel. He attended Harvard University and was the editor of a newspaper in 1997. In September 1997, he was visiting Israel with a college friend from Harvard.
So the attack was early September. So I think it was. So it was. I remember at the summer, right before the end of the fall semester. I'm pretty sure we were on the bus, and I remember hearing radio on the bus, and I think people were starting to talk about it. So that's when I think there were first indications of what had happened.
So while Franklin was on the bus that day, the 3 suicide bombers attacked the Ben Yehuda pedestrian mall, and Franklin described that pedestrian mall.
There are a number of cafes and markets. It's like a very nice promenade. It's also particularly popular, for tourists. And I know a lot of American students who are living, visiting, studying in Jerusalem. The time it's a popular hangout area.
So he was there on the bus. Where was his college friend?
His friend was on Ben Yehuda Street. In the immediate aftermath of the attacks, Franklin found his friend, who told him what he had seen.
He described what happened. He was sitting in a cafe, which is literally right next to where one of the terrorists had blown themselves up, and it happened literally moments after he had left and was starting to walk up Ben Yehuda Street. He was telling me how concerned he was about the waitresses who were he remembers the waitress at the cafe, and he was concerned that they may have been injured or killed.
It's very very scary.
Yeah, again, it's so scary to think about your life being threatened while you're just having lunch at a cafe.
Yes. And then the fear of even boarding a bus to go to work could cost you your life.
I think in general, I remember the atmosphere at the time was that there was a lot of tension because of the background of suicide bombings that occurred earlier in the summer. I remember it was always very tense getting on buses, and I remember almost every single bus I took, there were there were officers, people who would do spot checks.
That was very kind of Ron and Franklin to share their experiences with us. Definitely provides a much deeper understanding of the reality during that time period.
Yes, I am so glad that they shared their stories with us and experiences with us. And I think that it is important, in looking at it, when you hear Marzook talking out of one side of his mouth saying that they want peace more than anyone, and then they go over and conduct a triple suicide bombing. Those are stark contradictions.
Wow, that was a lot for one episode, Laura.
Yes. And why don't you guys join us next time for our next episode, Exiled.
Thank you. See you next time.
See you next time.
Hey, 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 hey.